welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Ari. I'm an aspiring author. If you're not new here, I'm so glad to see you back. I've been working on my novel, Pretend the Earth Doesn't Call, which is an eco-fantasy novel with found family and political conspiracies. And what I thought we would do today is go over my in-depth outlining process. There's a variety of different ways to outline. This is just the way that I'm outlining. And to catch you up on what I've done with Pretend the Earth Doesn't Call thus far. I've done a draft 0 draft, which is basically me telling myself the story. I've reversed outlined that 0 draft to try to give myself a better structure for the story. And then based off of that reverse outline, I went ahead and I wrote a dialogue first draft, which if you don't know what a dialogue first draft, it's basically when you take your book and write it like a screenplay. You're basically writing character dialogue. It's really trying to clarify character motivation, dialogue subtext, making sure your dialogue feels real and like it's propelling the plot forward. And then I've gone ahead and reverse outlined that dialogue first draft as well. So the stage that I'm at now is I'm ready to write like a very clean draft 1. And in order to do that, I want to create a very clear and concise outline. And the way that I like to do that is actually with an Excel spreadsheet. I've done it in the past, like for my reverse outlines, for example, I just, wrote down bulleted list 1, 2, 3, 4. This is scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. But when I'm writing a draft that I really want to be more legible and clear for somebody who's not just me, I actually really like to take this kind of like outlining process. And so what you can see here is I have an Excel spreadsheet. I've kind of only really filled out scene 1 for this, and what you can see is I have act, I have what plot point it's supposed to be, the scene number, I have a description of the scene, so I like to basically write out in detail what the scene is going to be. I like to break down my scenes into action and sequels. And if you don't know what a scene and sequel is, it's basically a writing technique where the scene is kind of like the active moment of a scene, which like has a clear goal, has a clear conflict, and it's then followed by what's called a sequel, which is kind of where the character then reacts to that action. Processes what happens, decides what the next step will be. And basically that sequel, what it does is it acts as a bridge between the active plot points of the story. The scene, the action of the scene will drive the plot forward. The sequel will help the reader understand the process of the character in a way. One of the reasons why I think scene sequel can be helpful is it really it breaks down scenes and sequels in very clear-cut ways. So a scene, for example, has a goal, has a conflict, has a disaster. A sequel has a reaction, a dilemma, a decision. And so for outlining stage, it really lets you be okay, this is the goal of the scene, this is how it gets messed up, this is the disaster, and so on and so forth. And also one of the reasons I think scene sequel can be helpful, I think it's a bit reflective of the way that human brains tend to process. And so there's something going on, and then generally right after you have a moment, like a beat of reflection. And so I really like to use it for my outlining process. So I have a scene description, and then I have action, which is basically the scene portion of the scene, right? So I have a goal, I have a conflict, I have a disaster. I'm going to show you what scene 1 looks like. So I have my main character sneaking into the house of a political figure, and she needs to get specific intel. So that's the goal of the scene. She needs to sneak into this house. She needs to get intel. She needs to not get caught. The conflict is that she knows the councilwoman is leaving the city in a few days and her house will be completely empty. And she knows that it would be a lot easier to sneak into the house and get the intel when the house is empty. But the deadline has been pushed up. She needs to go into the house early, and she needs to make sure that she's not getting caught. The disaster of that action is somebody actually comes back in when she's in the middle of trying to find the intel and going through the ledgers. She almost gets caught. So you can see I have a goal, I have a conflict, I have a disaster. What I like to do as well to really make my life a little bit easier is I like to have a column with stakes and consequences and a column with urgency and likelihood. So stakes and consequences, if she doesn't get the intel, what happens? Or if she gets caught, what happens? And the urgency and likelihood, how urgent is what she's doing in this scene is. Sometimes it can be really high urgency, sometimes it can be low urgency. And what are the chances that she's going to succeed? Is it very likely she's going to succeed, or is this kind of just an impossible feat? Stakes and consequences and urgency and likelihood are very important for me for my outlining process because they really help me visualize pacing. And so stakes and consequences and urgency and likelihood in the beginning of scene 2, where things tend to slow down for the stakes and consequences consequences and the urgency to be like super, super high, because that's a point in the book where it's actually you're getting into the fun and games and things kind of like slow down and the main character is trying to like figure out their way. Whereas like stakes and consequences and urgency and likelihood are going to be very, very high in the climax of the book, for example. And so I find that to be like really helpful to look at. And then I have the sequel, and the sequel components are the reaction, the dilemma, the decision. And I didn't really feel this out that much, but the reaction is relief that she didn't get caught, but she kind of did. Like, she left something out in the open that the counselor actually wound up seeing, and she's not sure if that will be indicative that somebody had like snuck into the house. The thing is with sequels is it can be a little bit tricky because it can actually bleed into the next scene. So actually my sequel winds up bleeding into the next scene. And the dilemma is like, does she tell her supervising officer that this happens, which might potentially jeopardize this promotion that she's been working on for many years. And then the decision is like, what does the main character ultimately decides? My main character ultimately decides that she's going to tell her supervising officer, even if it jeopardizes her promotion, because it would be really, really bad if she got caught and she kept it a secret. And then I like to basically summarize the main conflict. I like to specifically have a column that talks about character arc progression, because this is something I have a really hard time with. And character arc progression is like, I know the starting point, I know the middle point, and I know the end point of my character arc. I know that before I went into the story. But what's really tricky about character arcs is you want to make sure that it doesn't have to happen at every scene, but each scene should kind of like touch upon what motion that character is making towards the character arc. And so I know for my character, she's going from like extremely driven, willing to do whatever she has to do to rise in the ranks, and then the end of her character arc, I don't really want to spoil it, but the end of the character arc is different from that. And so I want to make sure that especially in the beginning, I'm really drilling home what her starting point of her character arc is, and I'm building that into the scene. And then another thing that I like to do is to add a column for through line progression. And if you don't know what a through line is basically the main thread of conflict in a story. So it's going to be the biggest piece of plot. It's not going to be subplot. It's like the main plot, the main conflict of the story. The through line here is the introduction to political climate, seeing there's something suspicious going on behind the scenes, but we don't really know what it is yet, but it's kind of like introducing the through line. What I've been doing is I kind of have this template. I'm actually not filling it out completely. I filled out scene 1, and then I wrote the prologue and I wrote chapter 1. And now that I'm done with chapter 1, I'm going in and I'm writing my outline for scene 2, because I find that it helps me really get very specific about my outline once I'm there, right? Like, I have a really hard time getting very specific about a scene until like I'm about to write it. I wish I was the type of person where it's like I could get very specific and write the whole outline, but I think my brain kind of tricks itself into thinking that I've already wrote the scene if I like do it all. And I also think that this really helps because then I don't have to go and like change my outline if something winds up changing. Like, I don't have to redo all of this work. Like, I'm filling it in as I go and I'm writing as I go, essentially. And so that's basically my outlining process. It's been really fun to write the prologue. I sent the prologue to Mick and Becca for feedback. Becca got back to me and she said she really liked it, and I'm excited to hear more about what they have to say about chapter 1. But that's essentially my process. I think it's really helpful to have to get extremely specific because it also helps you write a scene that has stakes, that has urgency, that has very clear scene goals and scene conflicts. Because something that happens to me is I actually can write a whole scene and there not be any conflict in it. And so having to do it this way really allows me to get very specific and figure out what the conflict is even before I go in and I write it. I've found it to be super helpful.